Hey everybody, welcome back. So I know today I said I wouldn't do a video, but I managed to feel a lot better. And I wanted to kind of put this out today before I had anything else going on. So let's kind of walk through this and get into it. Now, today we are going to be building a free AWS IAM lab. All right. So if you're trying to get into IAM, cloud, or cybersecurity, AWS IAM is one of those tools that you should probably understand because it shows up constantly in real job descriptions. Now, before we start clicking around in AWS, we need to clear up something that usually confuses a lot of people. AWS IAM is not the same kind of IAM as Intra ID. So we're going to kind of talk about that and start there. So let's move on. Now, when people hear IAM, they usually think of workforce identity, things like users, sign-ins, MFA, and app access, okay? That is where Intra ID usually lives. Now, AWS IAM is a different kind of ballgame. It is more about controlling access to AWS resources, okay? It decides what identities can do things like S3 buckets, EC2 instances, database, APIs, and other kinds of cloud services. So the easiest way to kind of think about it is like this. Intra is usually asking, can this person get into the app? And AWS is usually asking, what is this identity allowed to do once it actually touches AWS or any of the API systems? Now, that difference matters because it changes where the access decisions happen. So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, with Intra, the access check usually happens at the sign in. Can this person open the app? Do they need MFA? Are they allowed based on the policy? But with AWS IAM, the check usually happens every time something tries to do something in AWS. So if a user tries to read from a bucket, create a resource, call an API, or assume a role, AWS checks the permissions right there every single time with every single move. That is why AWS IAM feels more granular. It's not just about logging in, it's about every action, every resource, every time. So now that we kind of have a big understanding on what the difference between these two kinds of things are, the lab will make a lot more sense for you. So let's kind of get into that. Now, in this lab, what we're going to do is build the smallest useful version of an AWS IAM environment, okay? We are going to create a free AWS account, lock down the root user, set up a budget alert, create an IAM user, create a IAM role, switch into that role, and then look at S3 permissions. So I know that that sounds like a lot, but each piece connects to the next, and we're going to kind of take it step by step. Basically, the account gives us the environment. Root MFA protects that environment. The budget alert kind of protects your wallet and keeps you from spending money accidentally. And then the user gives us a basic identity. Now, the roles that you're going to see here show us the AWS native access pattern, and the S3 bucket is going to give us something real to inspect. So, first, we need the AWS account. So, let's get into that. Now, you're going to start by going to the AWS free tier page and creating your account. AWS will walk you through the normal setup, email, account name, password, contact information, all of that stuff. Please make sure that you choose the free plan and basic support. AWS does require a payment method, which is why we are not going to start building random services right away. Okay, before we touch IAM, users, roles, or S3, we just need to secure the most powerful account in AWS. That means locking down our root once we have the account. Now, the root user is basically the owner of the AWS account. It has extremely high levels of access. So you don't want it to be protected by only a password. Okay, so what you're going to do is basically go to security credentials and assign MFA to the root user. You're going to use an authenticator app, scan a QR code, enter, the two rotating code AWS asks for. And then once, root MFA is on, your account is in a much better starting position and it's going to look a lot more how we do this in real life. So now that we have protected access to the account, we also need a safety net for cost. So that is where the budget alert comes in. Now, this is creating the zero spend budget alert. This is important because AWS free tier does not mean every possible thing that you click is free forever. So before you click on something, extra besides anything in this video, please double check um, on their support page because it will be like one of those things where you'll spend money and you just won't know it. So That's why we're creating the budget alert. It'll also keep you notified of all of those things as well. So you can reach out to AWS support and be like, hey, I didn't mean to do that. And usually they'll work with you, especially if you're a student. Now, a budget alert, just to clarify, will not block the charges, but it will warn you quickly if AWS detects the spend, and you should be able to talk to them about it if something accidentally happens. You'll basically go into building and cost management, open up budget, choose the zero spend budget template, and then just it'll start an alert on your email. So now that we have the account protected from two angles, identity security with MFA and cost visibility with the budget alert, we can kind of finally move on to IAM. Now, well, here we go. So the first IAM object that we're creating is a user, okay? This is for learning. So in real companies, workforce users usually come into AWS through federation from like a tool like Entra or Okta. But creating an IAM user helps you kind of understand the AWS side without needing a full enterprise setup to get this done. So what we're going to do is create a user named lab admin, give it console access, set a password, and attach the read-only access policy. Now, we are using the read only because this lab is about learning the permission model, not giving ourselves power to change everything. Okay. So now that we have a basic IAM user, we can kind of move to the more important AWS pattern, which is roles. So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, roles are basically one of the biggest concepts to understand in AWS. A user is an identity you can sign in as, basically. A role is just like something an identity can kind of temporarily step into. So that matters because AWS relies heavily on temporary access instead of handing out permanent permissions everywhere. So basically, for this lab, you're going to create a role inside your AWS account that requires MFA, attach it to read only access, and then name it the lab read only role. So once that exists, the next step is basically to actually use it, and that is where role switching comes in. So let's kind of talk a little bit about that. Now, signing out of root and signing in as your IAM user you created, we're going to then use switch role, okay? What you'll do is you'll enter your AWS account ID, the role name, and the lab read-only role. When you switch into the roles, AWS gives you temporary credentials through STS. That is the part that makes roles click, all right? So you're not just logging in once and carrying out static permission set forever. You are stepping into a specific access context for a specific purpose. So now that we have an identity and a role, we need a resource to inspect. That is where the S3 comes in. So let's talk about that. Now, S3 is an AWS object storage. Okay, it is used for files, logs, backups, exports, application data, and a lot of other things that companies tend to care about. It shows up usually in a lot of cloud security conversations because bad S3 permissions can expose a lot of sensitive data. So for this lab, create the bucket, but do not upload files. Okay, keep block public access enabled as well. Leave the default settings alone and create the bucket, right? So now we have a real AWS resource. Next thing we need to understand is how to access that resource in a controlled manner, basically. So let's kind of move on. Right. Once you do everything the last time, you're going to open your bucket and basically go to the permissions page. The bucket policy box should be empty. And for this lab, that is a good thing. Basically, a bucket policy is a resource-based policy. So instead of attaching permissions to the identity, the policy lives on the resource itself. That means the bucket can define who is allowed to access it and what they can do. Now, the line I really want you to kind of recognize is principal. You'll see it up here. That means everyone. Okay, so when people talk about public S3 bucket problems, this is the kind of permission logic that they're usually talking about. So now that you can see users, roles, and resource policies, job descriptions will start to make a lot more sense, as you can see in the value of this tool. So reading a job description the right way, right? This is how you should kind of read IAM job descriptions, right? If a company is mostly a Microsoft shop, you may see Entra ID a lot more often. If a company is cloud native or heavily built in AWS, you may see a lot of AWS IAM stuff. In larger companies, especially like regulated enterprises, you're going to see a lot of both. That's going to be because the work first identity might need to start in Intra, or Okta, but AWS IAM still needs to control what happens inside AWS. So when a job description usually lists both, it's not random. Okay, it usually means that the identity starts in one place and then gets enforced across cloud environments in this other area. So before you close the lab, there's one final step that kind of matters just as much as the build. You need to clean up. So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, when the lab is over, please delete the S3 bucket, delete the IAM user, and delete the IAM role. But keep root MFA enabled and keep the budget alert turned on. Those are safety controls, not temporary lab pieces. Also, do not open files or launch extra services as part of this beginner lab because the point of this project is to understand AWS IAM, not accidentally create a bill, all right? So once the cleanup is done, you can use the resource slides to keep learning from the official docs, expand. If you want to start paying for stuff and you have a bigger setup that can afford it, absolutely use all the resources in here to get yourself set up. Let's kind of talk about the resources slide next. So I put a lot of the main AWS resources together so you can kind of follow the official documentation while you build. That includes the free tier sign up, IAM basics, root user security, MFA, IAM users, roles, some information about STS, S3 blocking public access, all of the stuff that you can see listed here. I also included some free deeper learning options like AWS Skill Builder and some well architected labs that you can kind of see over here. Now, after this lab, you can have somewhere to go next instead of just stop building at the demo. That is the full beginner AWS IAM lab. We created the account, secured the root, added a budget alert, created an IAM user, created a role, switched into that role, and looked at how S3 permissions work. Now, this is not meant to make you an AWS expert overnight, okay? It is meant to make AWS feel less abstract so that when you see it or enter ID, federation, roles, any of that jargon, you can actually have a real hands-on example to show your job. So save this for later and follow for more cyber, IAM, and home lab content. See you guys in the next one.